Following on from yesterday's video about mythquakes, so introducing the idea of a mythquake, someone asked, isn't mythquake just cognitive dissonance? What's different? Well, the short answer is yes, sort of, but there's actually a lot more to it. So cognitive dissonance, yes, it's one source, common source of mythquakes, but there are others, and the most obvious one is actually not so much cognitive dissonance as the absence of any cognition at all, following habit rather than actually thinking about something. So a mythquake arises when an assumption collides with reality, a misplaced assumption. So cognitive dissonance itself is only about the fact or the mechanism of a mismatch. It doesn't really tell us anything more than that. Whereas mythquake focuses more on the consequences of the mismatch rather than just the fact of mismatch. So a guiding criterion we're using for impact is that it's got life-changing effects, that it literally changes someone's life. That's when a mythquake becomes significant. There are masses upon masses of little mythquakes right the way through the day, but little things that don't match up. But the ones that we think are significant, up to the level of a quake rather than a tiny tremor, are the ones that have some kind of life-changing impact. And we've then got a measurement scale that goes in powers of 10, so it's an exponential scale. So 10 to the 0 means only one person's life is changed. 10 to the 1, or mythquake 1 level, is that can be up to 10 people's lives being changed here. By the time we get to, so we can easily get to something that's 1,000, tens of thousands, millions, tens of millions, right up into the billions level, until we get to a mythquake 9 and somewhat, which is actually an extinction level event, which we have a few of those on the horizon. So just saying cognitive dissonance doesn't tell us anything about this extra material, about the impact of that cognitive dissonance. Also, in a sense, it also helps us to identify that something, because cognitive dissonance merely tells us that the thinking is wrong, not what to do about that wrong thinking. And mythquake also adds a whole systematic structure for what to do before, during and after a mythquake. Before, we want to focus on identifying the possibility for a mythquake, mitigating any possible mythquake, and also building preparedness of when any mythquake might occur. During the mythquake, we've got structures that are about keeping panic at bay, providing guiding principles and so on, dealing with triage. And after, we've got to focus on recovery and also on a focus on learning. So if we just say it's the same as cognitive dissonance, all of that is missing. And also a much simpler one, if we look at just the terms, cognitive dissonance versus mythquake. Cognitive dissonance is a tangled term. It isn't even about sound anyway, so dissonance isn't even correct. It's kind of technical. Some even might describe it as elitist. It's 6 syllables long, it's a tangle to say, whereas mythquake rolls off the tongue in the same way that mistake does. In fact, there are some comparisons there. But also, mythquake as a term, it's immediately identifiable, it's descriptive. There is a quake, there is a myth involved, and there's a quake going on. And it's got a direct and actually quite accurate analogy with earthquakes. The build-up of tension and so on, and the way that tension can be built up the more and more we ignore the stresses that are driving that potential mythquake. The other thing we can do here is we can use that thing as an example, as a worked example of mythquake itself. So there's an assumption right here in the statement, isn't it just cognitive dissonance? Well, it's an assumption. It's unexamined, it's untested, it's unverified. In that sense, it's a myth. We have no way of knowing beforehand whether it's true. But when we collide with the reality department, right here, in a very simple way where I've explained there's much more to mythquake than just cognitive dissonance, then that's the actual impact. So it means that we have not just a myth, but a mythquake. It's collided with reality department. There are consequences to that collision. The consequence here is probably not life-changing for anyone. It may be, I don't know. But it shows us that there are possibilities here or options that are just being missed that are not available to us if we just say arbitrarily label it as cognitive dissonance, because it doesn't give us any guidance as to what to do about that cognitive dissonance. The fact of not having access to those means to change something means that the tiny mythquake could well become a much bigger mythquake with greater impact. So when we look at this in terms of the recovery from this particular mythquake, discovering that isn't mythquake just cognitive dissonance is actually an incorrect assumption. What do we do to recover from this? Well, the most important one is don't jump too quickly to assumptions. In particular, don't jump to obvious comparisons when you haven't actually looked in any depth at what's going on. Now that applies not just to mythquake itself, but for example to most of what's currently called enterprise architecture, my main field. There's a huge mythquake around the idea that it's only about IT. Instead, we need to realize that it's about the whole, and the assumption that it's only about IT has very serious consequences for what we can and can't access and work on during that event of working on an enterprise architecture. Likewise, right now I'm stuck in a hotel, having had the mismatch of the myth that I could arrive in Australia at any time and discovering that actually, no, I can't. So, no, it's not just cognitive dissonance. There's more to it than that.